May 8th, 1945, Berlin. The gunfire has stopped. Smoke drifts across shattered streets, where just days ago German soldiers fired their last desperate rounds. Among the rubble and ash lie hundreds of thousands of weapons, discarded, abandoned, silent. The MP40 submachine gun, the iconic weapon that had become synonymous with the Wehrmacht, now litters the ground like twisted metal weeds in a garden of destruction. American G's kick them aside as they move through captured buildings. Soviet soldiers stack them in piles along with helmets, ammunition belts and gas masks. British troops photograph them as trophies before loading them onto trucks. In farmhouses across Germany, terrified civilians bury them in gardens and toss them into rivers, desperate to erase any connection to the regime that has just fallen. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to these weapons after the guns fell silent? To understand the scale of what we're talking about, you need to grasp just how many MP40s existed in May 1945. Between 1940 and 1945, German factories produced over 1 million MP40 submachine guns. That's 1 million stamped steel weapons, each weighing just under 9 pounds, flooding across Europe from the frozen steppes of Russia to the deserts of North Africa. This wasn't just another weapon. The MP40 had become the symbol of German military power, seen in every newsreel, every propaganda film, every photograph of Wehrmacht soldiers. It was cheap to manufacture, reliable in combat, and devastatingly effective at close range. By the end of the war, these weapons were everywhere, in bunkers, warehouses, armories, abandoned vehicles, and the hands of soldiers who would never fire them again. The immediate aftermath was chaos. In the first 72 hours after Germany's surrender, Allied forces faced a logistical nightmare, unlike anything in military history. Imagine vast fields near captured German military bases stretching for acres, covered entirely in weapons. MP40s were stacked in pyramids 20 feet high. In some locations they were simply dumped in enormous piles, mixed with Kar 98K rifles, MG 42 machine guns, and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The Allies had to secure these weapons immediately. The fear was twofold: armed resistance from Nazi holdouts and the possibility of a black market that could fuel insurgency for decades. In the American zones of occupation, military police units conducted systematic sweeps. Every house was searched, every barn was inspected. American soldiers went door to door with translators, demanding that German civilians surrender any weapons in their possession. The threat was simple: cooperate or face imprisonment. In the British zones, the process was similarly thorough, but often more bureaucratic, with forms filled out and receipts given for confiscated weapons. The Soviets took a different approach entirely. In their zone, which covered eastern Germany, confiscation was swift and often brutal. Soviet soldiers had fought their way from Stalingrad to Berlin, and they had little patience for paperwork. What many people don't realize is that in those first weeks, hundreds of thousands of MP40s simply vanished. German soldiers, knowing the war was lost, made split-second decisions about their weapons. Some threw them into the Elbe River as they retreated west, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Divers today still pull MP40s from German rivers, their mechanisms rusted solid, their wooden stocks long rotted away. Others buried them. In fields across Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia, soldiers dug holes and cached their weapons, sometimes with the fantasy that Germany would rise again, sometimes simply because they didn't know what else to do. Farmers ploughing their fields in the 1950s and 60s would occasionally unearth these buried weapons, often reporting them to local police, sometimes keeping them hidden. The official Allied policy was destruction on a massive scale. By June 1945, the first industrial-scale scrapping operations began. At former German military facilities, Allied engineers set up crushing stations where weapons were fed into massive hydraulic presses. Imagine the sound. The screech of metal on metal as MP40s, each one a precision instrument of war, were compressed into cubes of scrap steel no bigger than a milk crate. These cubes were then loaded onto trains and shipped to steel mills, where they would be melted down and eventually transformed into peaceful products. Farming equipment, construction materials, automobile parts. In the American zone alone, an estimated 400,000 small arms were destroyed in the first year after the war. But destruction wasn't the only fate awaiting these weapons. The geopolitical landscape was shifting rapidly, and the MP40 was about to get a second life in conflicts the original manufacturers never imagined. The French were among the first to see the practical value in these captured weapons. France was attempting to reassert control over its colonial holdings in Indochina, and the French military needed weapons quickly and cheaply. Rather than destroy perfectly functional MP40s, French authorities diverted tens of thousands of them. By 1946, French colonial troops in Vietnam were carrying German MP40s alongside American M1 carbines and British Lee Enfield rifles. Vietnamese fighters would later capture many of these weapons and use them against the very forces that had brought them to Asia. The story gets stranger when you look at what happened in Eastern Europe. The Yugoslavian partisans under Tito had captured enormous quantities of German weapons during the war, and after 1945, they had no intention of giving them up. Yugoslavia maintained stockpiles of MP40s well into the 1950s, issuing them to territorial defense units and police forces. When you see photographs of Yugoslav border guards from the early Cold War period, you'll often spot MP40s slung over their shoulders. The same pattern played out in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Soviet-aligned states. The weapons of the defeated Reich became the tools of the new communist governments. Perhaps the most ironic twist involves Israel. In the late 1940s, as Jewish fighters prepared for the inevitable war following the end of the British Mandate in Palestine, they desperately needed weapons. Arms dealers across Europe, some working for the nascent Israeli state and some simply looking for profit, began acquiring surplus World War II weapons. MP44s, captured by the thousands and stored in Allied depots, found their way through shadowy channels to the Middle East. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israeli soldiers fought with the same weapon that had been used to guard concentration camps just 3 years earlier. The historical irony is staggering, but in the desperate arithmetic of survival, an effective weapon was an effective weapon, regardless of its origin. The Soviets took a particularly calculated approach to captured MP40s. Rather than immediately destroying them, Soviet military intelligence conducted extensive technical evaluations. Engineers disassembled the weapons, studied the stamping techniques that made them so cheap to produce, and analyzed the design philosophy behind them. This wasn't about copying the MP40 directly. The Soviets had their own submachine gun designs, but about understanding German manufacturing efficiency. Some of these weapons were retained for training purposes. Soviet military schools used captured MP40s to teach soldiers how to recognize and counter enemy weapons. Others were stored in vast warehouses in the Ural Mountains, kept as strategic reserves in case of future conflict. In remote corners of the world, MP40s turned up in the most unexpected places. In the chaos of post-war arms dealing, these weapons spread like seeds on the wind. By the 1950s, they appeared in conflicts across Latin America. Revolutionary groups in Cuba used them. Militias in various African independence movements carried them. In some cases, these weapons passed through so many hands that their origins became mythical. Just German guns with no clear chain of custody. Imagine an MP40, manufactured in a Erfurt factory in 1943, captured by American troops in France in 1944, sold to an arms dealer in 1947, shipped to Syria in 1949, and finally used in a border skirmish in 1956. That journey wasn't unusual. But what about the weapons that never made it to the scrapyard or the battlefield? Some MP40s survived through sheer bureaucratic accident. In the confusion of the occupation, some weapons were catalogued, tagged, and placed in storage, and then forgotten. In 1989, when workers were renovating a former American military building in Frankfurt, they broke through a false wall and found a room stacked floor to ceiling with crated weapons, including dozens of MP40s, still packed in cosmoline, a thick preservative grease. The weapons had been there for 44 years, preserved perfectly, a time capsule of 1945. Similar discoveries happened periodically throughout the Cold War. A barn in Austria, a sealed bunker in Norway, a warehouse basement in France. Each discovery made headlines, a reminder that the war's debris was still being uncovered decades later. The strangest survival story involves the ocean. As German forces retreated and collapsed in the final months of the war, some units near coastal areas made desperate attempts to prevent their weapons from falling into enemy hands by dumping them at sea. Off the coast of Denmark, near the island of Bornholm, local fishermen occasionally snag their nets on what they call the German dump, an area of the seabed where retreating German forces threw weapons, ammunition, and equipment into the water in May 1945. Danish military divers have recovered MP40s from this site, their metal corroded by decades of salt water, but still recognizable. In the Baltic Sea, similar dumps exist off the coasts of Poland and Lithuania. These underwater graveyards preserve a moment of panic and defeat, frozen in sediment and rust. Museums became the final resting place for thousands of MP40s, but the path to the display case was rarely straightforward. In the immediate post-war years, American soldiers brought home thousands of weapons as war trophies, often illegally. An MP40 was a prized souvenir, recognizable, compact, and imbued with the mystique of having belonged to the enemy. Many of these trophies sat in attics and basements for decades. As the soldiers who brought them home aged and died, their families often had no idea what to do with these weapons. Some were turned over to police departments during gun amnesty programs. Others were sold to collectors. The best preserved examples eventually made their way to military museums, where they now sit behind glass with small plaques explaining their history. The legal status of these weapons created a complex web of regulations that varied wildly by country. In the United States, pre-1986 automatic weapons could be legally owned with proper registration, which meant that MP40Ss became collectible items, sometimes selling for thousands of dollars. In Germany, possessing such weapons was strictly regulated, with most examples in private hands required to be deactivated. In Britain, the laws were even stricter. This legal patchwork meant that identical weapons manufactured in the same factory, possibly on the same day, could have vastly different fates, depending on where they ended up geographically. The MP40's influence didn't end with the destruction or distribution of the physical weapons. The design itself became a template studied by weapons engineers worldwide. The stamping and welding techniques that made the MP40 cheap and quick to manufacture influenced post-war submachine gun design in numerous countries. When you look at weapons developed in the 1950s and 60s, you can see echoes of the MP40's design philosophy: simplicity, ease of manufacture, reliability. The American M3 grease gun, while developed during the war, shared the MP40's commitment to stamped metal construction. Post-war designs from Israel, Spain, and other nations showed similar influences. The physical weapons might have been destroyed or hidden, but the ideas they represented lived on. By the 1960s, the remaining stockpiles of MP40S in official hands were largely obsolete. Modern submachine guns like the Uzi, the Sterling, and various Kalashnikov variants had surpassed the MP40 in every measurable way. The few MP40S still in service were relegated to rear echelon troops, guard units, and ceremonial purposes. The Portuguese colonial forces used them in Africa into the 1960s. Some police departments in rural areas of Germany used them as late as the 1970s, simply because they were available and functional. But these were the exceptions. The age of the MP40 had passed. Today, if you want to see an MP40, your options are limited but fascinating. Major military museums across the world display them as historical artifacts. The Imperial War Museum in London has several examples, each with detailed provenance. The Smithsonian in Washington holds multiple variants. In Germany, museums approach the display of such weapons with particular sensitivity, often contextualizing them within broader exhibitions about the war and its consequences. These museum pieces represent the tiny fraction that survived through official channels, documented and preserved as educational tools. But the real mystery lies in the unknown number that still exist in private hands, hidden away, undocumented. Across rural Germany, family legends persist about grandparents who buried weapons that were never recovered. In barns across France, attics in Poland, and storage units in America, MP40S almost certainly still sit, forgotten or deliberately concealed. Every few years, a construction project unearths one. A renovation reveals one behind a wall. These discoveries generate brief local news stories before the weapons are confiscated and destroyed or donated to museums. The strangest chapter in the MP40's post-war story might be the replicas and reproductions. As collecting military firearms became a popular hobby in the late 20th century, and as original MP40s became increasingly rare and expensive, several manufacturers began producing semi-automatic reproductions that looked identical to the original, but fired only one shot per trigger pull, making them legal in more jurisdictions. These reproductions, ironically manufactured in countries like the United States and sold to collectors worldwide, ensured that the visual legacy of the MP40 survived even as the original weapons disappeared. Today, you're more likely to see a reproduction MP40 at a gun range than an original from 1943. The environmental impact of 1 million weapons being destroyed, buried, or dumped is something rarely discussed, but worth considering. The MP40 was made primarily of steel with wooden stocks and various springs and small components. When hundreds of thousands were crushed and melted, that steel re-entered the industrial cycle, becoming part of the economic recovery of post-war Europe. But the ones that were buried or dumped contaminated soil and water with rust, lead from ammunition and various chemical residues from cosmoline and gun oil. Clean-up operations in the 1980s and 90s, when construction in former military zones uncovered caches of weapons and ammunition, sometimes required environmental remediation. The war's detritus had become environmental hazards. Film and television have kept the MP40 alive in popular consciousness in a way that preservation never could. Every World War II movie featuring German soldiers shows them carrying MP40s. These are usually replicas or deactivated originals modified for film use, but their presence in popular media means that people who have never seen a real MP40 instantly recognize its silhouette. This cinematic immortality is its own form of survival, not physical, but cultural. The weapon lives on as a symbol divorced from its original deadly purpose, transformed into a prop that signifies a particular moment in history. The final accounting will never be complete. Of the estimated 1 million MP40s produced, perhaps 100,000 still exist in some form, in museums, private collections, police evidence rooms, and forgotten hiding places. Another 400,000 were almost certainly destroyed in official scrapping operations. The remaining 500,000, lost to rust at the bottom of rivers, melted down in unmarked scrap operations, destroyed in subsequent conflicts, buried in locations now paved over or built upon. Each weapon represented about 40 hours of labor in a German factory, stamped out by workers who may have been forced laborers, prisoners of war, or German civilians desperately trying to survive. Those million weapons produced in desperation were scattered to the winds when that desperation finally ended. What really happened to the German MP40 submachine guns after World War II is a story without a single answer. They were destroyed and preserved, scattered and collected, forgotten and remembered. Some became relics in museums, others became tools in new wars, and still others simply dissolved into rust and memory. They were the physical embodiment of a regime that tried to conquer the world and failed, and their dispersal represents not just the defeat of that regime, but the chaotic transformation that followed. In the end, these weapons outlived the ideology that created them, surviving as historical artifacts, collector's items, and occasional discoveries that remind us the war's physical remnants are still with us, buried in fields and hidden in attics. Silent witnesses to a conflict that ended 8 decades ago, but whose echoes still resonate through the metal urn.